I was what Paul calls a carnal, a fleshly Christian, very immature. We belong to the First Presbyterian Church of Franklin, Tennessee, and they always ask the lawyers and the bankers and the CPAs to serve on the every member canvass. Did y'all ever do an every member canvass here at Westminster? We haven't done it since I've been here. I just killed that whole idea. You may remember those. We would divide up the church into zones, and we would go to people's houses and knock on their door and take a pledge card in, and we would sit down in their living room and tell them why they ought to fill it out, and we would wait while they filled it out. That wasn't my idea of a good time. I'm glad we don't do that anymore. The Generalissimo at First Presbyterian Church was a brash competitor of mine named Fred Williams. Fred was several years older than me. He went to Wake Forest Law School. I went to Vanderbilt. He went to Wake Forest. He was an ex-Marine. He was assertive. He was brash. And let me put this generously, he was pugnacious. He called me up and he said, "Ramp, I know what kind of money you're making." He didn't know it, but he thought he knew. He said, "I see from your pledge card that you're giving about $2,000 a year. Unacceptable. This coming year, I'm expecting you to step up." Whoa, excuse me. I resented Fred's attitude. I resented Fred's challenge, but most of all, I resented the fact that Fred knew that I was a cheapskate. For some people, $40 a week is a lot of money. It seriously is. But at that stage of my career, it was not even close. "It's going to cost you," Fred said. And I'm thinking, this guy is relentless. Who is this guy? I said, "Okay, how much?" It's like two lawyers negotiating a settlement. Nothing biblical about this. He said, "I'm expecting you to give $5,000 next year." I thought, what a relief. $5,000, I can handle that. I was expecting a much bigger number, maybe 4 or 5 times that amount. And sure enough, we caved into the pressure. We increased our pledge that year. I don't know if we gave $4,000 or $5,000, more than we'd ever given. But we did it out of a sense of duty and guilt. We did it because I had been called out. I didn't want to be embarrassed. I didn't want to be seen as a cheapskate. The following year, in the providence of God, they put me in charge of stewardship at the church. And another lawyer, he and I were both generalissimos. Now it took 2 of us to replace Fred. But this was a life-changing experience for me. For the first time in my life, I studied how much income the church needs to take in to accomplish its mission. I'd always thought of stewardship sort of like paying your dues. This was a whole new ballgame. Suddenly, the responsibility of this loomed large. What if the church doesn't raise the money it needs to pay the salary and the light bill and all the things it needs to do to be an attractive, active, vibrant church? What if the people don't get it? What if they don't step up? What if we run short of funds? What if I don't do a good job explaining and making the case? What if we fall short? What if I'm an inadequate leader? And I guarantee you I was. How terrible, how embarrassing. So I began to pray. I know that must sound crazy. For the first time in my life, I saw stewardship as a spiritual issue. Lord, help us get it. Help me do a good job. Now, I'm still motivated by duty, but now my duty was to help the church. But I could also see a spiritual dimension here. So you might say I graduated from pure duty to I have a desire to do a good job. And I admit I wanted to avoid embarrassment. I wanted to help the church thrive. I wanted to please God. And I prayed that God would touch people's hearts so they'd be generous. I remember making a little deal with God. I said, "God, if this thing turns out to be a dud, I will take that as a sign that I have absolutely no talent for ministry, and that'll be the end of that." And it turns out that God blessed our efforts, and we exceeded the goal by 30%. No one could, least of all me. Pretty amazing. But looking back, it was still about me. I was concerned about accomplishing a task, making the church look good. I didn't want to fail. God honored that. That was King David's problem. King David wanted to build the magnificent temple, but God said, "No, you've got blood on your hands. I'm choosing Solomon to build my house." And David was disappointed, but he was also anxious. He knew that Solomon didn't know how to raise money. Solomon was young. He didn't know how to be a king. So David contributed vast amounts of wealth. and all his plans, and he exhorted everybody to get on board to support Solomon. And they did. And the temple was magnificent, and everybody was happy. But like Steve, King David was most concerned about appearances more than he was concerned about God. And we find the same thing in Paul's letter. There's an anxiety here. Paul wants to go back to Jerusalem, and he wants to take this big gift back to the poor folks in Jerusalem. And he'd been promised a big gift, and some of the churches had contributed. And Paul wanted to make sure that the Corinthians remembered their promise and that they'd be able to honor their promise. And so he gets them to go ahead and start working on it now before I come. He's giving them a heads up so that they'll be ready. He didn't want them to be embarrassed, and he didn't want to be embarrassed. Most of us can relate to Paul's thinking. We want the church to be able to do its work. We want our programs and our people to grow. And so we contribute to help things along, and that's a good thing. We feel a duty to give, and we have a desire to help the church and to please God. And if that's where you are, God will bless that. But there's a third dimension here that I find much more compelling and uplifting. I'm not there yet, but I'm hopefully working toward it. It doesn't spring from duty, and it doesn't spring from a desire to accomplish a specific goal. It doesn't really have to do with us